Welcome to the Determined Truth Podcast.
Want the truth? You can't handle the truth.
Where we aim to explore questions of truth, the scriptures, and what it means for the church today. Here are your hosts, Rob Dalrymple and Vinnie Angelo.
Hey everyone, welcome in. We are in episode 4 of our study through 2 Corinthians. We've been focusing on this letter, spending a lot of time looking at application in terms of church health, church leadership, and that sort of thing. So we'll do that and take another pass today. Is there anything that you wanted to focus on specifically today that we need to intro, or what do we want to do?
I think we're going to really actually just pick up on the conversation that we've been having. And it might seem like we're not surveying 2 Corinthians. We'll do our best to get into the text. We plan on 5 episodes. It's going to be a little bit more than 5 episodes. But we do plan on like really going through the text itself. But our conversation is really focusing on, hey, here's what Paul's saying to the church in Corinth, both 1st and 2 Corinthians. And here's what we are reflecting on in the modern church. And I think this is just an important conversation. I said to you before we started, Vinnie, and I want to just kind of iterate this to the listeners, and that is, we don't want to sound like all we're doing is whining and complaining. Mm-hmm. I hope we're coming across as saying, hey, we're trying to prophetically speak into something that we see a disconnect between what Paul's telling the church in Corinth, how he is leading, and how we see churches being led today and congregations being led today. And so we're going to pick up that conversation on leadership a little bit because we see this great disconnect and we want to bring that out. And hopefully we're not whining or complaining. I don't think we are, but I want to make sure we're not. And if you think we are, it's probably your fault because we're not.
The listener or me?
The listener. Yeah, the listener.
Oh, so the listener's fault. Yeah. It's all responsibility. No.
Absolutely. Yeah. Just come on, check yourself. Check your heart.
I've had this conversation recently with someone when it was talking about church issues and what's the difference between gossip and rebuke. And that might be even a way to start the conversation because you're talking about saying, hey, we're not just whining. And oftentimes anything critical or negative said about like a church institution or organization is seen as, oh, you're just being critical, you're just whining, you're gossiping, or whatever pejorative is put there. And those things certainly exist. There are people who gossip, there are people who complain and criticize just for the sake of it. But there's a difference. And I asked this person, what's the difference between gossip and rebuke, or gossip and being a prophetic voice when something's not right? Okay. And I think there are differences. I think a lot of times there are people who believe that they are being prophetic or they are rebuking in a loving way. And it really is just an excuse for being gossip. So there's a dividing line there that is really thin, and it's not always seen that it's altruistic and whatnot. But that is a question that we need to grapple with. And we can't just assume for ourselves or others that just because a negative critique is coming out, we can't assume that it means it's unloving or it's gossip, or if it's whining. No, this could be a true statement. And you just hope that the messenger is doing it with a true motive.
Okay, so before I give my thought, how do you answer, or how do they answer you? And then how do you answer the statement?
Honestly, the person I was speaking with I don't believe has ever thought in those sorts of categories. Sure. And didn't have, I think this person didn't even have the ability to nuance the difference between the two.
You know what we should do right now? Here's what we should do. We should say, if you want the answer to this question, because I think most of our listeners probably don't know the answer either, that you need to contribute, and we'll do a special episode.
So if you go to Determined Truth and go to the Give tab, we'll have the special answers, the special podcast.
We're trying to monetize this thing, and it's just not working. So we're coming up with.
We do need to monetize because we both have mortgages to pay, but we'll give the answer to everyone regardless of food
to buy. Yeah.
Yes, exactly.
I'm not worried about the mortgage. That'll take 6 months before they evict me. But if I don't eat, I'll be dead in 6 months. So
that's true.
Anyways, go ahead.
Yeah. Part of it is being able to have the nuance to think through certain things. And so are you in the habit of actually thinking differently? Can you have different categories, or is everything just black and white? It's either good, it's either bad. Do we try to actually understand people where they're coming from and the critique they're coming from? I think part of it is, if we're someone who might naturally be opposed to critique, why is that the case? When I used to teach a class on Christians and politics, one of the things that we would do is bring up that usually the more staunch and more of a conviction you have towards something, you oftentimes have less ability to have self-critique. and you get very defensive when anyone critiques you. This is one of the problems with nationalism, is the inability to critique oneself. You assume that our nation is the best. We could do no wrong. I'll critique the other side, but I can't critique my own tribe, right? And it's very tribalistic. Right. I think people do that in the church without being nationalistic or anything like that, but you're just unwilling to have any kind of critique towards your own people, because that means we're going against God, or we're speaking against the man of God, or speaking against the anointed, or whatever kind of way that we've been groomed to just not challenge anything.
Yeah, and actually, we're going to have a live stream coming up here sometime. By the time this episode goes live, which should be pretty soon, talking about politics and the importance of critiquing your own tribe. Just don't just be a Democrat or just be a Republican and think, okay, this is everything that the other party does is bad, but our party is good. No, actually, there's problems on both parties, and we need to be able to critique both, including self-critique.
Well, and how often does that happen in the church, where
exactly
we can't look back at the Crusades and say, oh, that was evil, because the kingdom of God does not go and expand the kingdom through military force, convert or die. They were Christians. They did it in the name of Jesus. They were fighting those awful Muslims. This is the excuse,
right? Yeah, I know.
The justification. So these were the people in the name of Jesus fighting against these evil, disgusting Muslims. Therefore, it's justified. We can't critique this. So the ultimate problem is that even in a historic event like that, we have the inability to say, we messed up here, we were wrong. We try to justify it. We can never, ever condemn our own group for something. And that's a form of not being able to critique oneself, which means, man, you're never actually going to try to strive for goodness if you have the inability to critique oneself. Which is, think about it. What was the response to the prophets? Even in the New Testament, it's like, you killed the prophets. Why? Because they didn't like the message for the self-critique that was happening through the prophets to the people of Israel.
Exactly. And by the way, the history of Christianity, that's what we've done in this podcast and live streams, is saying we have to reckon with our anti-Semitism in the history of the Christian church. There's no question about the fact that the largest purveyors of anti-Semitism have been Christians throughout history.
Yes.
The distinction I would make between a rebuke and gossip, first off, would be your intent. The goal of a rebuke is for transformation. The goal of a rebuke is to point out wrong prophetically. And maybe the best way to say it, of course, is the goal is love. I love you enough to say, I want you to understand what you're doing is wrong so that you might change your ways and transform and repent. Whereas gossip is usually not spoken to the individual that you're trying to rebuke. It's spoken to somebody else to put that other individual down. That's simply the antithesis of love. And it's often done, you gossip, to make yourself look better and while you're putting somebody else down. So intent and the key thing, and this is the hard thing, is always knowing that love needs to be at the forefront of whatever we're doing. And gossip is not loving.
Yeah. So let's let that lead in. Not that today's goal was to talk about gossip, but I think it's our thought on why we would actually speak negatively or critique or rebuke or challenge the church today, is because that's what's happening in these letters. I had a professor in seminary say, if you got a letter from Paul, chances are things weren't going well for you. The churches weren't excited when they got letters from Paul. Some of them, obviously, there's some of them that are great, but oftentimes it's like,
they threw Jeremiah's into the fire, right?
Exactly.
Hey, Baruch, we got to go do that again.
So exactly. So as we look at trying to understand leadership and what does healthy church leadership look like, what is unhealthy church leadership, because sometimes the best way to figure out what something is to define what it's not, and to say, okay, avoid this.
Yes,
so
good point.
I don't know if we were to look at how to understand leadership, oftentimes leaders in the church today are just in just a stark contrast to what the church was trying to set up to be in the first century.
That's actually a really good point. Michael Gorman does an excellent job, even in his discussion of Corinthians, to point us to Philippians 2. And maybe it's worthwhile that we turn there for just a second, because Paul has this mindset of cruciformity. And Philippians 2 is probably the preeminent passage that describes this. So obviously verses 1 through 4 are really important in Philippians 2, but verse 5, have this attitude in yourselves, which was also in Christ Jesus, who, although he existed in the form of God, didn't regard equality with God a thing to be grasped. But he emptied himself, taking the form of a bondservant, being made in the likeness of men. Being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to death, even death on a cross. This is, I think, this formational thing of saying, Look at Christ. Verse 4 says, don't look out for your own personal interests, but also for the interests of others. Verse 3, consider others more important than yourself. It's this attitude of cruciformity, of saying, I have this cross-bearing love for the sake of the other. And the answer is, that's what the leader should be doing. That's what the pastor should be doing. Now, this is really hard because having been a lead pastor, there's a point at which if you're too vulnerable, because there's almost a vulnerability here, right? I'm going to humble myself and serve. I'm going to wash your feet. I'm going to gird myself with this towel and wash your feet. That it's very easy for people to take advantage of that. And trust me, I don't care if you have a healthy congregation or an unhealthy one, even more so obviously in an unhealthy one. Even in a healthy congregation, there are people looking to find your weakness, to find your vulnerability, and take advantage of that. And so a lot of pastors, understandably, are guarded because they just can't be transparent because someone's going to take advantage of that. And I think Jesus is saying, hey, you got to be good with that. You got to be good with that. And you got to be able to go. And when they take advantage of that, the response from somebody else should be, that can't be true about Rob because I know him, or because I've seen him, or Vinnie, because I've seen the way they act. I'm not sure I believe you right now. In other words, the way we respond to that and the way we've handled ourselves before and into that, when somebody tries to take advantage of us, like, yeah, I'm not sure I'm buying that one because our character speaks for itself. But we're afraid to do that, understandably, because of the consequences of where it leads. It's for a lot of pastors, Vinnie, and I've worked on committees in our denomination where we worked with pastors in churches, work with ordination of pastors in churches, work with churches that were in trouble. There's a lot of pastors that are just in a lot of trouble and a lot of turmoil. And it's almost, and oftentimes, I won't say it's almost always, but it's oftentimes not their fault. It's the congregation's unhealthiness. So that's where I would start in terms of what it looks like. The problem for today that we've been discussing a little bit, of course, is that we have this culture of celebrity pastor and consumer churches that we've been talking about. Capitalism is the way it is, and capitalism says we must grow. And so, as we've said many times, how big is your church? This becomes the barometer by which we test our pastors. So here we're telling pastors to be humble and servants and everything else, the very things that don't lead to church growth. And yet they're judged by whether or not their churches are successful and growing.
Hey everyone, we want to thank you for joining us on today's podcast. And we want to remind you that everything we provide at Determined Truth is free of charge. And this even includes all of the teaching that Rob does on a weekly basis to pastors in India and around the world. We don't have any supporters that get special behind the scenes access. But we can only do this with the generous support that comes from those of you who can afford to give. So if you would prayerfully consider supporting us with anything from $5 a month or more, we will continue to work hard to challenge the church to be the church. To give, go to determinedtruth.com and click on the Give tab, or follow the link in the show notes. A couple years ago, I was teaching on Philippians 2, and I'm working this out right now.
The older you get, by the way,
it was a couple years ago. It was like 10 years ago.
Yeah, you say a couple years ago. You don't say years ago. It's just a couple of years ago.
So I'm thinking, like, for me, I'm like, when I think of myself, I'm like, oh yeah, I'm in my early 30s. I'm like, oh, I'm going to be 46 on Monday or Sunday, whatever it is. It's like, oh, but I'm still in my early 30s. How can I be 46?
I think I'm in my early 30s, and then I go out for a run and I get like 10 steps. I'm like, oh man, I am not in my 30s anymore. The first 10 steps, I make sure the knee's going to be stable enough to make it for 10 more steps. Make sure I don't make any sharp turns. I run on straight lines. Yeah.
I just get out of bed and I'm like, my sciatica. I'm such an old man. But I made the comment, I was teaching on Philippians 2. And someone made the comment about, but we have to stick up for ourselves and defend ourselves.
Oh, yeah.
And so I pushed back a little. I made a comment. I'd love to know your thoughts on it, because I want to play with this. I just haven't done it as much because there's nuance there. But I said, Christianity is a doormat religion. Like there's a sense in which, no, we are to be a doormat. And I needed to be careful because in this group of people that I was speaking to, I actually knew that there was a number of people who came from low income situations, like some of them extreme poverty. I know that there was some ladies who had experienced abuse. And so
that's very good point. Yeah.
And so I'm like,
because that's not what we're called to be as a doormat is not. Yeah, exactly. So make sure.
And so in one sense, Christianity is a doormat religion. We are called to lay ourselves down. We are called to be meek. We are called to to be cross bearers. Yet it's not just or right to allow someone else to sin against us. Yet,
Right.
and so it's not right for a man to abuse a woman or anyone to abuse anyone.
Exactly.
Those things aren't
Right.
right. However, it's wrong for the guy to hit his wife. And so we stick up for that. Yet it's also wrong to
Stick up for the wife
execute.
that's been abused.
Yes. Yes. But it's also wrong for the King of Kings to be wrongly accused and crucified. Yet he didn't stick up for himself, even when he could
Exactly.
have called down army of angels. So what do you do with that? So Christianity is a doormat religion, yet it's not. I don't like, even there, when it comes to defending yourself in the mode of being vulnerable and erring on the side of, yeah, I'm probably going to be abused, but it's not loving to allow other people to empower other people to abuse you.
Right.
What do we do with that? And is it different for the pastor than for the congregation?
Say it again.
Is it different? Is it different for the pastor? Because we just started talking about, from a pastoral standpoint, being transparent and vulnerable. Is it different for the pastor than it would just be for the average Christian?
Yes and no, because obviously there's an authority and there's a semblance of power and power dynamic we'll talk about in a minute, perhaps. I would say I don't like the way it's phrased. A doormat is a negative phrase. And maybe if we took it and turned it to a positive phrase, that we are called to love our neighbor. And as love is, I lay down my life for you and I sacrifice for the sake of the husbands. Love your wives as Christ loved the church and laid down his life for her. Now, love does not allow you to abuse me. Love does not allow violence. Love does not allow sin and criminality. A doormat would be, I'm just taking my abuse because you're wiping your feet on me and you got your boot on my neck. No, so that's why I think the doormat analogy doesn't quite capture what's being articulated. Is more, no, it's a proactive love, washing their feet of the other, caring about the other more than yourself, so much that Jesus allowed them to crucify him and didn't give a response. Doesn't mean that I'm going to allow myself to be abused or beaten, but if the authorities want to decapitate me, the authorities want to decapitate me. By the way, a number of years ago, I realized decapitation is not actually the right word, because you don't have your head chopped off. You have your body severed from your head. You're deboditated, right? Your body doesn't go, where's my head? Your head goes, where's my body? So I think we need to say deboditated, and just throw that out there. Some of my old-time students might remember that phrase.
That's the hill you should die on. That's the hill you should die on, and you should start a revolution on this one.
Where's my? I always
this is what the world needs now.
If I'm being beheaded on a guillotine, I'm going to drink some water right the moment the thing comes down, so the water comes trickling out. Anyways,
that's true. But I'm thinking back, and I forget if I've made this or raised this question before. I remember as a kid, so sometime in the 80s, because that's when the movie Witness came out. Remember, with Harrison Ford, and he's a cop who, come on, he's a cop.
Yeah, but I can watch a movie all over again for the first time.
That's true. That's true.
So, yeah.
He is wrapped up in some sort of murder investigation, and this Amish family takes him in as he's recovering. And so he's living with them for a while. And there's this scene in which he's living with the Amish people, because I think he has to go into hiding because there's a corrupt cop that's after him. It's something like that.
Okay.
And I remember there's the scene. So he's living like an Amish man. He's out on the horse and buggy, and they go into town to get some ice cream. And there's these knucklehead jerks who are messing with the Amish family, and they go and they take, because they got ice cream cones. The knucklehead goes up and takes one of the Amish guys' ice cream and it takes it from him and starts like putting it on his face and humiliating it. I'm watching this and I'm like, dude, I'm a child of the 80s, so I'm ready for Han Solo, Indiana Jones to come out and whoop some butt. And you could tell he wants to. He's a cop. And then the Amish are like, no, dude, like, we just take this. And I remember watching that as a kid and being struck by that, because that's so countercultural. But it's okay. Is that Christian? And you read someone like a Tolstoy when he talks about the Sermon on the Mount and what it means to turn the other cheek and whatnot. And it's like Tolstoy would say, yes, it's exactly that. You don't defend yourself in any kind of way.
Okay.
Where in our American context, it's no, you would defend yourself. So is there a spectrum of thought there? Obviously, on an Amish standpoint, they're completely nonviolent. And so you're not going to respond in any kind of way. But so is that the true Jesus example of meekness and turning the other cheek? Or is there somewhere along the spectrum to actually defend yourself and stop the person from doing it? It's like, what is the Christian way of dealing with that?
Okay, first thing is this: there isn't the Christian way. I think we have to be careful about that, because as soon as we do that, we're making it legalistic. That here's the rules and here's the lines and here's our Here's our 40 laws as to what working on the Sabbath constitutes. That's Pharisaical.
Okay.
The
Good.
biblical text is wisdom oriented. What's the wise thing to do? And the question here is, do I speak to a fool or do I not speak to a fool? The two Proverbs in
Okay.
26, chapter 26,
Sure.
back to back.
26, yeah.
Wisdom says, in this instance, I speak to a fool because he's going to be wise in his own eyes. Or does wisdom say, don't speak to a fool? My first thought is, if you're doing it to me, it's easier to say, don't speak to the fool and hold up my witness and go, at the end of the day, I guess I respect that person. At the same time, however, if they're doing that to my children, I think I might react differently. But then at the same time, I'm like, yeah, but what am I teaching my children? I'm certainly not going to sit there and say the Amish are wrong in this, because I think they need to be respected for their stance. Their stance is a noble stance. I'm not sure if it's right or not in all situations, but it's certainly noble. And I certainly take my hat off to them and give them respect.
Which is funny because the average Christian would see that and mock that.
Yes,
where it's
I
like
agree.
and I think that's probably the default view. That's not my default view, but that should be the kind of the default Christian view, where we say that seems right. We should be more reactive when we see the Chuck Norris response. I think in America, our natural instinct is to think that defending yourself physically is the virtuous Christian response.
But Jesus said, if anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn him the other one also, which could be if anyone puts an ice cream cone in your face, turn him the other one also.
So what does that look like then from a Christian pastor standpoint? Going back to that conversation, when is the pastor to defend himself? What does transparency look like from a pastoral standpoint? The pastor just put everything out there. Is it loving to the congregation when you know that your congregation, there might be some who are going to take advantage of that? So is that actually loving to them to be that transparent? Because how much damage might it do to the rest of the congregation? These are just some of the things to grapple with. And I guess for you, you would say it'd come back to a wisdom thing.
It's totally a wisdom thing. And it's totally what is the best interest of the individual? What is the loving thing to do here? And when you're talking about a pastor, it's a loving thing to do for the individual and for the congregation, because you have a community of people who need to look to you as the discipler, as the leader for whom they are following. And so how do you demonstrate Christ-like love to them? And has your reputation, integrity been so impugned that people aren't listening to you? So maybe I do need to respond because of the position I have. But the difficulty in answering the question is we have a hypothetical here without any concrete example. And so you're thinking of one thing, I'm thinking of something else, the listeners are thinking of something else. And so it's extremely difficult to speak to, but I would simply say it's a wisdom thing. And the goal is always love. What is the loving thing to do for the sake of the other? And that includes, in this instance, the congregation and the community to whom you are discipling. But notice it doesn't reflect necessarily your own reputation, your own ego. That's not on the agenda. What's on the agenda is my authority. Like Paul defends himself. So there's no question he does that. That's why we're having this conversation. It's the most autobiographical of all of Paul's writings. He's defending his apostolicity. He begins 2 Corinthians and 1 Corinthians with, I'm an apostle by the will of God. So hey, let's make sure you got this down right. I really am an apostle, and it's God's will that I am. But he's doing that because his authority is being challenged and people are not going to listen now. And therefore it's important to do so. And in doing so, so is wrong when they say I'm not. He's not doing that. So I hope that helps.
So no, this is good. Let's move the conversation along then with that transition. Okay. So we would say that a pastor or church leader who is having the posture of defending themselves in order to preserve their power, that becomes a danger. And what we mean by power is not necessarily like this Thanos kind of power where you're ruling from this throne and you're dictating. There's some very seemingly meek people who could be holding on to their power. It's that control that they have, it's the influence they have. And so power isn't necessarily the dominating type of person. So we would say if the reason for why you're defending yourself, if the reason why you're not allowing people in is to hold on to that power, that's probably an incorrect motive.
Yeah, power is dangerous. And that's the problem and the danger inherent with being a pastor, is that you're put into a position of authority and power, and it corrupts. And it is very dangerous, and it's very hard. And we have to be really careful. And again, let me iterate here that There are a lot of pastors out there doing a really good job in very difficult situations, good elders, good leaders, good faithful followers in difficult situations. Handling a congregation of 50, handling a congregation of 500 is just simply very difficult. And the lure and the danger is power.
When we look at churches and power, this isn't just a modern issue that comes up. And like I said, I've been in a congregation of 50, 70 people. I've been in a congregation of 5,000 people. You know, I've been in different kinds of churches over the years. And the appeal to power, I think, could be there in any kind of, like you said, anytime you have a spiritual authority over anyone, that lure for power is going to be there. So it's not, okay, once you hit the mega church, you're going to hit that. But I would say one of the issues that pops up with the mega church is there's a different kind of power that could appeal itself, that could present itself.
Yeah.
But what's interesting is the church hasn't always been a mega church model, and there always hasn't been this level of power with that pastor. Part of this is going back to church history, and I think we're oftentimes ignorant of church history. We oftentimes think church history is like, oh, it was Adam and Eve, and then Noah, and then King David, and then John the Baptist, and Jesus, and Paul, and then Martin Luther, and then Billy Graham, and then my church, and that's church history. Right? That's all you need to know about church history. Something happened in the 300s within the Roman Empire. There's a sequence of things. It wasn't just one thing, but it changed the trajectory of how the church is going to be viewed, because up until 313, Christianity was illegal for the most part, right?
Not necessarily illegal, and it depends on what part of the empire you were in. But 303 to 313 was the Great Persecution, where
it was gnarly.
Christian books and buildings, they didn't have any buildings, but were banned and burned. And a lot of the pastors and bishops were actually being persecuted. Prior to 303 to 313, and it's called the Great Persecution. Prior to that, we have a misunderstanding. Persecutions were sporadic, they were occasional, and they were often isolated, regional, like this region over here or that region over there. And most of the time, the bishop was left untouched because he was so respected and revered in the community that if you went after the bishop, you got the ire of all the people, and that you have an uprising in your community. So the political leaders, the Romans, would just simply leave them alone lest they have a mutiny on their hands. But with the Great Persecution, now you got bishops and priests and clergy being maimed and torn asunder, and like they were inventing ways to brutally kill these people. And so that's the Great Persecution. So that's in 313 when Constantine ends it with the Edict of Milan, ending the Great Persecution and bringing that,
which is also interesting, just as a side point. And I'm actually, I think I mentioned on the last episode, I'm starting to do YouTube videos. The next one I have coming up is going to be on the Council in Nicaea, because that's oftentimes very misunderstood.
Okay.
One thing to think about, because one of the charges popularly is that Christianity, as we know, it was basically invented at the Council of Nicaea. That's when we invented the deity of Jesus. That's when we created the Trinity. That's when we decided which Bible or which Gospels were in the Bible, and it was all paganized. What I find interesting is you talk about the great persecution that happened between 303 and 313. The Council of Nicaea happens in 325. And Constantine says, hey, all the bishops are invited, bring 2 presbyters, bring 2 servants. You have a couple hundred, between 250 and maybe 318 bishops who come. That's depending on who you read, it's those numbers. You have all these people coming. These are going to be guys who are walking with limps and are missing limbs and have scars.
Or eyes gouged out. Yeah.
Eyes gouged out. These are men who are the survivors of this.
Yes.
Illegal Christianity is a new concept to them. Even if it's a decade old, that's not that old. They're not just going to get in this room and be wowed by an emperor and then abandon their conscience and what they've known. They're working some stuff out because they haven't had the opportunity to do that. But I think one of the errors that creeps up is this is where they just paganized everything. No, these are men of conviction. They were willing to risk persecution up until now. They're not just going to be so easily given over. However, with that being said, you do see some changes that do happen within the church from a formal standpoint that do come out of this, and why we would say, hey, it's good to not persecute Christians. It's not all good to develop this Christendom, right? We hope you're enjoying the podcast, and we want to remind you that everything we do at Determined Truth, the podcast, Rob's blog, and our YouTube channel is available on the Determined Truth app. Directions on how to download the app is available in the show notes and on the determinedtruth.com website. Just click on the app tab. So what happened through the remainder of that 4th century that maybe put the Christian church on a different trajectory in terms of how we practice organized religion?
A lot of people, that's a really good. And by the way, it's vinnieangelo.com or your YouTube channel
Actually,
is.
my YouTube channel is Vinnie_Angelo. And I have a series called Theo Ride where I go on a motorcycle and you could watch motorcycle clips and then hear a teaching.
Very good. Subscribe to that. I encourage you to do. So what's interesting about what we just discussed there, at 313, the Edict of Milan, the persecution ends. 325, there was a theological debate that I'm sure you'll address in your discussion of the Council of Nicaea, that Constantine's, okay, this is dividing the empire. Let's get all the bishops together. All costs are on me. Everybody can come and I'll take care of everything. And Constantine presided over the council. And there's your problem, because now
he presided, but he didn't direct it.
Correct. But he still looked at as the authority.
Yep.
And so all of a sudden now Constantine, a few years later, goes, I think I'm going to change my mind on this deity of Jesus Trinity thing. And 5 different times, Athanasius, the great hero of the story, is sent into exile for his very life because he's trying to get all the bishops to agree to the deity of Jesus and what we come to know as understands the Trinity. It's a formulation of what the church has always believed. And depending on who the ruler was, depends upon whether Athanasius is okay or whether Athanasius has to leave. And you're setting a pattern where the governmental authorities are speaking into and presiding over it. That's one of the problems I have with the church, with the Anglican church. I've seen some good stuff on it. Michael Bird and Scott McKnight, like the King or Queen of England is the head of the church. I don't see how that can make any sense. But the problem becomes this. So Constantine begins flowing money into the church now. These formerly persecuted people and formerly buildings and books were burned and all this good stuff. Now the tide seems to turn there. And money's given for buildings. Some of the first buildings really happened after Constantine. There really weren't many buildings burned.
You met in homes before that.
They met in homes. Yes, that's correct.
Yeah.
But if that home would be burned if it was declared to be a church. But as far as cathedrals are concerned, all those are 4th century. All those are after Constantine. Yep. And you start getting money for clerical gowns and robes for the choir. By the way, I had a conversation with our church because it was an old congregation. They wanted to get young. They wanted to bring new people in. And I was explaining, hey, look, your choir is great, but everyone in the choir is 60 to 90, 85. And they're singing songs that are 50 years old, and they're not going to reach any new people. I get it. It ministers to you, but we need to give and love and lay down our life for the other and make them feel welcome and wanted as well. And I get there's a argument to be made on both sides there. But I'm like, and the choir robes set you apart. It's like you're in and they're not. And the response was, well, the choir robes initially were done because, some of the poor people couldn't have nice clothes. So everyone could wear choir robes and all look the same, whether you're rich or whether you're poor. And I'm like, okay, that's a really good argument. But I said, do you know when choir robes came in? When did we first start wearing choir robes? I have no idea. I said, after Constantine gave money to the church so they can have choir robes. And it's the response of power and wealth and money coming in. It doesn't actually go back to the 1st century. So this noble idea that we're not going to distinguish between rich and poor. And so I can go both ways on that one there a little bit, but the reality is money and power came in with the coming of Constantine. And of course, Theodosius I makes Christianity the official religion of the Roman Empire in 380. And, Father Leo, God rest his soul, as you might know, Vinnie, he passed away this last week.
I saw that.
And just a wonderful man. And he was 98 years old, almost 99. And he would have been 99, and I think in December. And an Orthodox bishop, an Orthodox priest, wonderful.
He was a mentor for you for years, right?
Yeah, for a number. We got together, and I wanted him to be a mentor for me, but it was one of those. I respected him as obviously a much older man, way older than I am, Right? But an older man that I can go to as a source, not connected with my local church. So it was great because he's Orthodox and I had a resource, but he loved having conversations with me because I love your knowledge of the scriptures, Rob. So we really had this wonderful relationship there for a number of years. And he was talking about Constantine and all the great things that it did. And I said, Father, wait a minute, this is horrible. He's like, oh no, Rob, this is great. All the bishops that were persecuted now they're empowered and the empire is on our side. And I'm like, yeah, that's the problem. That we went to bed with the empire I said, Father Leo, I said, look what happened to the church in Syria. This is recent history now. I was meeting with some pastors in Middle Eastern pastors throughout the Bay Area, as you might remember, Vinnie, 2010, 2011, 2012. And one of the pastors was from Syria. And at the time, the uprisings in the Arab world, they started in Tunisia and started spreading. They hadn't reached Syria yet. And this one Syrian priest, a Catholic priest, said to me, he says, Rob, if it reaches Syria, the church is done. I said, well, what do you mean? He says, because the church in Syria has allied itself with Bashar al-Assad, the head of Syria. He said they did it because that's the only way they can get favor without being persecuted. And he gave them political cover. The problem is Bashar al-Assad is a despot and is doing all these bad things. And if people revolt, they're going to revolt against him. And they're going to take it out on anyone who allied with him. So this becomes a danger. When we go to bed with the emperor, we become beholden to the emperor. And I think it becomes extremely problematic. So I said to Father Leo that I think Constantine's Christianizing the Roman emperor, which officially becomes under Theodosius I, was one of the worst events that could ever have happened in the history of the church.
Yeah.
I'm happy that the Great Persecution ended. Don't misunderstand me. But I think we became worse off when we became empowered. Yeah,
So
I think that's the American church today, by the way.
I was going to say, let's bring it back to today. So the title celebrity pastor has been something that's been coined over the last 20 years with the advent of TV, radio. You could go back to the 1800s and look at Spurgeon. Was he a celebrity pastor? Was D.L. Moody a celebrity pastor? These are people that you
Billy
know
Sunday.
about.
Yep.
Yeah. But nowadays it's so much more common because of social media, because of all these other platforms, because of the mega church itself. You have this sort of thing. And you and I have been part of various different congregations where, so-and-so might say, I go to this church, and this church might have 4,000 or 5,000 people who attend. And they'll say, so-and-so is my pastor. Yet they've never had a conversation with this guy at all. But what they mean is, I listen to his sermons and therefore he's my pastor. Where the word pastor is shepherd. This person has never shepherded them outside of maybe giving them good information.
Know them from Adam if they met them in the grocery store.
Exactly.
Hi, Pastor so-and-so. I go to your church.
Yeah, awesome.
Yeah.
It's a celebrity pastor concept, which is somewhat of it's an oxymoron in so many different ways. But Caitlin Beatty, she has a book called Celebrities for Jesus, and she defines a celebrity pastor as social power without proximity. How do we want to maybe flesh that out a little bit more? That without proximity.
Yeah, this is really good. Her basic definition of proximity in her work is someone who is knowing the people and is close to them and is involved. What I would say is the primary role of the pastor is discipling them. And a disciple is someone who imitates their rabbi. When we started the seminary in Northern California, Vinnie, that you might remember back in 2008, 2009, one of the things I said as I was the dean for a while, we're hiring professors to come in and speak, or prospective professors to come in and speak. And I said, here's the deal. It was going to be a commuter school to some extent, to a large extent. I said, I don't want you to come in for a 6 o'clock class from 6 o'clock to 9 o'clock and come in at 5:50 and set up at 6 o'clock and then leave at 9 o'clock. I want you to come in at 5 o'clock and have dinner with the students. I want you to invite them to your house on the weekends. I want you to go to their kids' soccer games. I want you to be part of their life as much as possible, because that's what a rabbi is. You're not just coming to instruct, you're coming to be a rabbi. And we try to have this rabbinical model that says, we want you to be in their life and a part of their life. And I think that's the big thing. One of the things that started to sour me on the mega church, and I worked at one, as you know, for a number of years, for more than 8 years, was I began watching people walk out of the service. And they might have known me because my face was up on the screen once in a while. I preached a few times, but advertisements for classes and things that I did. But we had a number of pastors that were dynamic leaders, just dynamic leaders, that their face wasn't public. And I'm standing next to one of them one day, and I'm watching 1,800 people come out of the auditorium, because we had several services with about 1,800 or so per service. And I'm thinking, you don't know who this guy is. You don't know who this guy is. You don't know who this guy is. Almost none of you know who this guy is, because if you did, you'd stop and say hi. And I thought, we're not shepherding. We're not pastoring. They're consumers. They're coming to consume. and then they leave. And I thought that's just the antithesis of what the church is supposed to be. So yeah, what are some of your thoughts before I go any
Well,
further?
I was just going to say, going back to your heart behind wanting to start a certain philosophy on your seminary, Koinonia, was that the name of the seminary?
Yeah, Cornell Graduate School of
Yeah,
Theology.
which means fellowship, right?
Yeah.
So I remember going back to my seminary experience, and even I went to a Christian college, and so I'm thinking of my main theology professor. The professors, usually the best professors, did that with us.
Yes.
And so I'm even thinking, I'm still friends. Obviously, you were my Greek professor. We had a relationship before that, so that's a different type of thing. But I still have relationships with some of my seminary professors, and I'm thinking back to one of my main college theology professor, and it was that sort of thing. They would say, hey, like if anyone wants to come early for night classes, I'm going to be here for dinner. Anyone can come. Hey, we have a Saturday class. Friday night, does anyone local want to host something, and we'll get together and do a thing?
Exactly.
It's that sort of thing. And I remember we've all met the pastors who are more academically minded. They're not as pastoral. They want to be teachers in that sort of thing. And oftentimes the critique is, man, that guy is really talented, but he should probably go teach at a seminary or something. He's more of an academic. He should be in the classroom. And this is usually something that I've heard that by a number of people in different contexts. And it's from people who have never been to seminary. And I tell them, no, because the academically minded pastor who doesn't want to shepherd people, he would be a terrible seminary professor, because a good seminary professor is going to want to shepherd his students in that context. It's not just about disseminating information.
The professor has to be a professor who pastors, and the pastor has to be a pastor who teaches. Right?
That's great.
They both have to have a mix of both. Now, you might have 60-41 or fine.
Yep.
And maybe you belong in the local church because you are more pastoral. But some of the best professors indeed are the ones who are also pastoral. And if you're not pastoral, what are you doing in our seminaries?
And I would say as well, the best professors I had were probably bivocational, serving in their local churches in some kind of capacity.
Yeah.
And not always. Some of them couldn't, just because their professorship was a full-time job, but most of them were involved. Even the full-time professors were involved shepherding people in a local congregation.
Yeah, and this is where it goes back to the megachurch a little bit. So we discussed this actually in a Bible study I had last night. We were talking about the same topic, which we've been discussing before. Give a couple stories. When I went back from my PhD work to Pennsylvania, Tony and I started looking for a church. And we relocated. We're looking for a church. We go to attend a couple of churches, and we went to this one church one Sunday, and it was a church plant, but it had been a plant for a couple of years, and there was maybe 100 or more, 150, 200 people there. And the pastor came up before the service and greeted us, asked us our names, talked with us, engaged with us. The next Sunday, we decided to go back. And he walks up to us and he goes, Rob, Tony, Justin, Jordan, Jared. Mackenzie hadn't been born yet. I'm like, oh, that was good. He was intentional, not only about meeting us before the service and learning our names, but he studied our names over the course of the week. Because when we came back the following week, he knew our names. And some people have a gift like that. I could tell you a story about Hitler, but that would not be relevant to this conversation right now. But maybe I'll do it when we're done. There's a really scary story about Hitler. My great uncle met him several times as a POW.
Wow.
This pastor was intentional about that, and it was a crazy gift. Now, I've also been to mega churches where I preach, and you're carted off to the green room. And I'm like, a green room? What's that? There's a microwave, there's a refrigerator, there's food on the table, there's a television up there. You watch the service from up there. There's a stagehand who comes back and says, hey, you're on in 5 minutes. Is your microphone ready? And then they escort you up, and then you walk up. And then when you're done preaching, you walk back to the green room. And I'm like, there's no interaction with the congregation at all. As we've discussed before, I have a big problem with sermons because they're not interactive. They're not participatory. People are just listening to a lecture. They're just consuming. It's a bad way to learn. If I'm misunderstood, then who's to correct it? But the pastor is carted away. And that's not a pastor. So let me give you another story. Karunakar, one of the pastors in India that I've been working with since 2008, I think it was, that I first met him. A dynamic leader, as I've said many times here, one of the best leaders I've ever met, phenomenal leader. He had a problem. He was renting facility from a Hindu landlord who was good to him, but The Hindu landlord was getting problems from the other community saying, why are you renting that out to a Christian church? You need to take your building back and rent it out to Hindus. And so the landlord was like, hey, look, I got to kick you guys out. He's like, I need to get a building of my own so that I don't have the problems with rent. So we began talking about this. And he had this opportunity to purchase land at half the price. It was just divine opportunities that were arising. So I said to him, I said, so how big a building are you going to build? He's like, oh, I'm thinking about maybe for 900. And I said to him, why would you do that? He said, what do you mean? I said, if you have 900 people, you can't possibly know them all. Mm-hmm. I don't see how a pastor can know more than 200. I think 200 is a top limit, where you know everybody that comes in, where you can speak to everybody that comes in. I had 125, 140 or whatever at my church for a while. It got down to 80 or 90 at a point in time. And it was hard to see everybody because somebody might come up to you and they might engage you before or after church and take your 10 minutes. I had 30 minutes, but you took 10 of it. Now I can't meet everybody. And some people come in late, so I can't meet them before service. I have to meet them after the service. So I said to Karunakar, I said, you can't possibly know everybody. I said, here's what I think you should do. Build a building for 200. And then you'll know everybody. And at the same time that people are coming in, you're training up leaders so that as soon as it gets to more than 200, you take one of those leaders and say, hey, you go take this group and start a church over there. And you're constantly starting new churches because you're training leaders to do, and you're constantly sending them out. And he listens, which is one of the dangerous things about my role, is that he really listens to everything I say. I have to be really careful. But I really think that's what I think the pastor should be and the pastor should do. And I'll give you one more here. If you want to interject, go ahead and do so now. I got another story.
That's good.
Okay, cool. So one of the things that's really become popular is multi-site churches.
Yeah.
And when I first heard of multi-site churches, I thought, okay, here's the good news. One of the bad news is I really respect Francis Chan's model of the house church. I don't respect the idea that Francis Chan said, I don't know if he still holds this or not, he said, every year that home group splits off and starts more home groups. I get the idea of that, but that home group in a year has formed a community, and you can't sever that community like that. You have to be careful about taking them away from their family and their community to go start something new. The problem also becomes, how do you train leaders to start all those other groups out there? You can't do that possibly in a 1 year in a home group. So leadership training is a significant issue. And I think the church does a horrible job at that. We need to do a better job. We need to allocate more resources for that, more training for that, and requiring that. Too many churches don't require formal training, and I think that's too critical to do. And I think our training should extend beyond Bible and theology and preaching good sermons. It's got to go to counseling. There's got to be business practices, how to run a budget, how to hire and fire people, which, that does happen in churches. You have to, how to handle conflict and mediation and all that stuff. Those are things that pastors are not really trained in. So when the multi-site model came up, I thought, well, here's the good news. You only need one pastor who can preach really well, and then he can be videoed out to 5 or 6 or 7 or 10 other sites. And I live in Arizona now, and there are multi-site churches everywhere. They're not just mega churches. There's 10 mega churches all with one site. And what that means is that there's one site where the guy preaches or the gal preaches, and then it's videoed to the other sites. And then there's a host pastor at each of the multi-sites. And the multi-sites are all mega churches too. And there's dozens of these in the greater Phoenix area. And so the idea is, okay, great. You only need one really good preacher to do that. But the bad part is, we had a large church in our town that you and I attended, Vinnie. And that city had poor areas, and it had middle-class areas, and it had a few wealthy areas. You can't preach a sermon that touches all those peoples.
No.
This is in Livermore, California. You can't preach a sermon that reaches the people that live on Junction Avenue and at the same time live in Ruby Hill. And that means something to you, Vinnie. Ruby Hill is expensive. Junction Avenue is poor. I went to middle school in Junction Avenue Middle School. You can't do that. So as soon as you have a multi-site, how do you now preach to somebody who lives in a poorer town with a middle class? You can't do this. You need, the scripture is taking the word of God and contextualizing it to that local community in their local context. And sure, there are some issues that transcend a local context. Maybe they're national or international, but I just think we've become a consumer model, and we're Macy's. And I don't, is Macy's still in business?
I don't even know.
Avenue. Yeah. Saks Fifth Avenue. And I know Sears Roebuck is out of business now.
Yeah.
We're Walmarts and Targets. There you go. We're Walmarts and Targets.
Yeah. That's actually a good way of putting it.
Yeah, because come here and get everything you need all at once. Get your groceries and your kids over there and your youth over there and marriage over there and singles over there. and we're missing the gospel and the mission of the church.
And I think it's easy to throw that entire thing and condemn it as bad. And we could say, okay, there's still good that comes from Targets and Walmarts. I definitely have my critique of Targets and Walmarts, especially. But okay, yeah, it's still employing people. Oftentimes, lower income people can buy something cheaper than they would somewhere else. It's providing commerce through taxation to the community. So there's things where it's okay, this isn't all, like, you could find the good in it, right? You could commend and condemn everything. However, is that ultimately the best thing for your community? Is there a better way across the board that could do something? And you could probably make that argument. I would say the same thing when it comes to church models. Because like I said, you and I have been a part of a mega church model that also had multi-sites. And I was part of that multi-site where you were part of the main facility.
That's right. You were, yeah.
Yeah. And that's where you could say, okay, hey, I saw great things happen there. There was legit pastors doing legit pastoring. I think one of the critiques of the multi-site model is that there's just no pastor at the local area and people are just going and watching a movie and then they're leaving. No, there's legitimate pastors, there's legitimate staff, there's great community that's being met, there's good stuff that's there. But is it worth it for what you have to give up to get that? And like you said, you're creating a consumer model. You're not, I'm thinking of our situation, you had 4 or 5 total campuses and you have one person preaching. So you have thousands of people who are coming between these multi-sites and you're not doing anything more than raising up one leader on a Sunday. And there might be 4 or 5 people in that teaching pool total who might be teaching throughout the year. But you're just not growing your leaders that way. You're not giving opportunities. You are making it an attractional thing. You put everything else together with what does our church have to offer that would attract people here instead of going to the other one in town, and it becomes a competition. And this becomes even another conversation, but I've noticed this in being part of larger churches. I've been a part of a couple of them. How often do we actually get new converts, and how often do we just get lateral moves? Someone's sick of the other church, and so they're just coming to our church. You're actually not making converts and you're not making new disciples. You're providing something until they're bored with it and the next thing comes into business.
Now, let's note, by the way, that there can be good ways to do it, that you can make a multi-site model work.
Yes.
Let's suppose, and I'm not saying that none of them are doing that, because there are multi-site models, of course, where the local pastor, the campus pastor, he goes on stage, he does the announcements, he's visible before the congregation. Hey, here's who I am. If you have any needs, I'm available. And he's maneuvering around because he's not preparing for a sermon. So he's maneuvering around the congregation before the services starts and after the service is over. He's available, he's accessible. That's great. But what I think is missing from it also, obviously the size becomes an issue. I just don't see how you can pastor all these people when it's that large. People can come in and come out too easily. But what if the sermon were 10 minutes or 15 minutes? And you have the great preacher who says, here's the text. And then the local pastor says, let's talk about what this means in our context. Now you can make it work. So I think you can make it work. I just don't think for the most part it really is happening.
Let me wrap up with a great example of this. In our context, the campus I was part of, which we were the first multi-site campus that we developed. We had originally bought land, but we couldn't move into that land for a couple of years, probably 4 years or so, 3 or 4 years. We finally got the opportunity to move onto that land, but we weren't able to build yet. So there was office buildings there that we could use midweek, but we couldn't make that, we couldn't build a facility. And the city I was in, we're about 45 minutes away from where you guys were at, separated by a hill and a valley, completely different communities. Even like you had talked about how in the city you were in, it was also connected to some very wealthy cities.
Yes.
And so I would say the average income of your guys' campus it's got to be in the multiple 6 figures. There's a lot of wealth in that area. My community did not have that. We had some of those people, but we were not that community at all. So the idea of
they lived in your community because they couldn't afford to live in my community.
But oftentimes work in your community.
That's correct. And they would travel that one road with all the traffic, Vasco Road with all the traffic. But the housing was so much cheaper because you were 45 minutes away that they could move out there.
At one point, the idea was, hey, when we're going to launch our land that we're moving on, because we've been in a public high school and these other places for years, let's have a big dinner. we'll celebrate it, and then we'll do like this pledge drive because they've done those before in your context, and that pays off a lot of money because you could bring out the checkbook and people will write checks. And so we spent, I don't even know how many tens of thousands of dollars bringing in the giant tents, bringing in all the stuff, having this catered meal. People get to come to the facility for the first time. We feed them a meal. And guess what happens at the end of the night and the days following? We realize, oh yeah, we totally went in the red because our community was like, dude, our church is throwing us this awesome party. Great. They don't have they don't have tens of thousands of dollars to throw at this other thing. And so it actually backfired because the context of the two communities is completely different. And the other community, hey, if that works in that community, awesome, do that. Yeah. But that doesn't work for us. But you don't know that if you're not in that community. So it's just an exact example of contextualization.
Which just tells you that the sermon that came from the Livermore campus where I worked shouldn't be the same sermon that's coming to the Brentwood campus where you worked, because the communities are two different communities. It's a commuter community. They're struggling to have time with their wife and their children because they're driving an hour each way to work or longer. The disposable income is not what it is because the gas and cars and everything, all the expenses. They're missing their kids' Little League games. Whereas my community had lower income parts, Junction Avenue, where I grew up, but also had
extremely high income,
extremely wealthy Hollywood North. Communities like Blackhawk that were as wealthy as Hollywood. Yeah, great.
That's where the professional athletes of the Bay Area live, is in some of those areas that would, and you even have professional athletes playing for the San Francisco Giants and whatnot who attended the campus that you were at. That's the type of community you had.
Yeah. Hey, let's wrap it this way because I want to make sure. I know we said at the beginning we don't want to sound like we're complaining. What we're trying to do is critique the church to say, are we being the church that we're supposed to be? Do we reflect the humility of Christ, laying down our lives for one another, laying down our lives for our neighbors, laying down our lives for our enemies or even our spouses? And the danger of power and the danger of the celebrity pastor that happens is that we walk away from that sacrificial love for the sake of the other because of power, influence, esteem, notoriety, and that becomes intensely problematic. And that's what we're trying to challenge. We're not saying that if you're listening, you can't go to a mega church or you shouldn't go there. I'm just questioning whether or not we can truly follow out the gospel command of proclamation of cross-bearing love for the sake of the other, proclamation of selling your possessions and giving to the poor and following me. And I'm not saying that, and we're not saying that they can't be rich. The question is not whether you're rich, it's what you do with the wealth and how you use it. Jesus meets Zacchaeus and doesn't say sell it all, Zacchaeus, and give it away. But the rich young ruler needed to give it all away, and there's a good conversation as to why that. So we're wrestling with these questions. When we're not saying that there are answers, we're saying wisdom is needed to discern what the answers might be. So I hope that's what we're doing, is sparking a conversation. And what I hope, if you are listening going, hey, I'm in that world and I'm discontent as well, I would recommend Jesus and John Wayne as a book to read, to go, hey, this is where our young people are at, especially if you're older. It's where your kids and grandkids are at, because they're struggling with this as well. But find a community where you can lament and pray together and not complain about all the woes and everything that's wrong, but discern, how can we be a remedy? How can we carry out cross-bearing love for the sake of our neighbors within this small community? And maybe that small community is part of a bigger church. That's fine. Or maybe it's members of other churches. But let's see if we can't carry it out. Let's meditate on 1st and 2nd Corinthians and go, what does this look like in our community and living it out? That's what we're trying to exhort you to do. And so we're trying to say, hey, call out what you might already be experiencing. Go, yeah, I do see that. Okay. Well, I think the solution then is finding a community of people devoted to following Jesus for whoever and whatever he commands and says, in love and wisdom and sacrifice and service for the sake of the other. And then meditating, praying, fasting, studying, learning, eating, fellowshipping, teaching together, giving, serving.
Yeah. And that does go back to the beginning conversation of you can rebuke without just whining and complaining. Yes. And so we're engaging what you would call condemning and commending. What are the things that we could find good here, but what are the things that we do need to critique? Everything isn't either it's good or it's bad. And we ought to be able to do both. And just to close up on this, because this has actually come up twice in the last week from yesterday, I had lunch with a former pastor that you and I both worked with at that church. He made a type of comment, and he's no longer on that church staff, that came out of another conversation I had with a group of former coworkers last week, which it's the same comment. And this is something to look at for when you need a large staff to make the machine run at a large church. And look at the fruit of people. You rarely see a church staff at a large church hanging out for a long time and being there a long time. And a lot of it is just the overall burnout. Any kind of ministry is hard. You were the solo pastor at a church of 100 people. That's difficult. But there's something different, I think. It's a different kind of hard in the large church model. And the term that came up in both ways is it's so hard to make the machine go, because you're constantly at that level. You're just having to make things go. Throwing a service every weekend, producing a service, is a lot of hard work. You're throwing like a concert every weekend. That's a lot of hard work. And then you got to make it happen again next week. And then guess what? You have this youth event in which 300 high school kids are going to show up. And those are huge numbers, right? All these things that you have to do. Keeping the machine going is exhausting. And look at the fruit of your pastors, especially when we don't give sabbaticals and things like that. When they leave ministry, they're often done. They literally have nothing else to give. And it's a direct byproduct of they're not merely burnt out because they were just ministering. They're just trying to keep the machine going. Because if that machine's not going, if we just say, hey guys, we can't do VBS this year, we can't do the high school summer camp, what the parents are going to freak out. We're going to go to the church who does, because you're not offering the program we want. That it wrecks pastors. And you wouldn't believe how many pastors end their season of ministry and they're like, we're done. I don't even want to go to church right now because I can't handle the machine. That's
not just the pastors, but the staff too. The staff.
Exactly.
And so let's talk next time about volunteers and the role of volunteers as well.
Okay.
And then we'll hopefully finish this conversation and get into the nuts and bolts some more of 2 Corinthians as well.
Yeah. Hey, everyone. Hope you might not enjoy this episode in the series, but I think this is needed. Hopefully it's giving you something to think about. Please don't walk away with fodder to complain. Be productive. Be part of
be a difference
solution.
Maker. Yeah, exactly.
Be a difference in a positive way. Yeah.
Exactly.
And so love your congregation and ask the same question. What does love require of me to bring up these concerns I have to my pastor? How should I do that? In what way should I do that? What's the loving way? What's going on with my pastor right now? How should I do that? Or don't just
should I do that? Let's ask the question, should they do that? Because we're not sending them to their pastors necessarily, because we might be sending them as sheep before a lion. And they got to be careful.
I completely agree.
Yeah.
So just use wisdom as you proceed with this, because we always hear new information and then we get all fired up and that becomes our hobby horse. So just watch that. If you haven't already, there's 2 whole new comments on the app in terms of the review. So thank you for you 2 people. What about everyone else? We know we get more than 2 downloads per episode. I know that because I just looked at the stats before we came on here. So come on, folks, get in here. You're part of this thing. So try to get this out to more people. And next week, we'll continue on the conversation of 2 Corinthians. Catch you guys then. I want to thank you for joining us on today's podcast. And we would love for you to share the work of Determined Truth with others. Please follow this podcast and give a review on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Your review will go a long way towards helping others find this podcast. Then share it with others so that we can get the word of the gospel of the kingdom to more people.